The weather report in the July 1st, 1911 New York Tribune stated, "Today and tomorrow fair, variable winds." Boy, that was an understatement. Now the temperature would rise to 90 degrees, and that was just for starters. Today we call it a heat wave, but back in 1911 the most commonly used phrase was hot wave. The New England weather for June 1911 had been typical. It was comfortable sleeping weather at night and warm sunny days. By the beginning of July, the weather would change and it would become deadly. You see, here's what happened. Dry air from the southern Great Plains began flowing up into Canada and then turning south, heading for the East Coast, thereby blocking off any ocean breezes. This, in turn, caused the temperatures to rise to dangerous levels. Now, there's an old saying in New England, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute, it will change. Now, believe me, it is true. In early April, you can have blizzards in the morning, and by afternoon, the temperature will have risen to about 7 degrees. Or better yet, I don't know how many times I have shoveled 5 to 10 inches of partly cloudy weather. It's an inside joke, anybody who grew up in New England. So, summertime in New England can get a little hot, to the point where it is uncomfortable, but a heat wave will turn uncomfortable to extremely dangerous. Now, to beat the heat in 2024, we wear clothes such as shorts and t-shirts to be comfortable. The period clothing of 1911 was not conducive for comfort. Now, add in the fact that in 1911 there was no such thing as air conditioning for the masses. You now have a recipe for disaster. Now, throughout the late spring and early summer, the uncomfortable weather was starting. The May 23rd, 1911 Pittsburgh Post ran the headline, "All May records broken. Mercury soars to 99 degrees in streets. 4 deaths as a result." Those 4 dead were just the beginning. Now, Ryan Colantonio, writing about the great heat wave of 1911 for NOAA, stated, "The July 11th heat wave is possibly the deadliest weather event in New England history. It led to massive forest fires, deadly lightning, and record temperatures that still stand over 100 years later." So how bad was this heat wave? And how did the people cope with this unbearable heat? Well, July 2nd, the New York Tribune, page 2, ran an article reporting, "Great heat in Chicago. Reliable thermometers on street register 100 degrees. People were dying from the heat." The article continued, "In St. Paul, Minnesota, Philip LaFerrari died from heat while C.B. Buckley was laid prostrate by the sun. Anton Schaefer of St. Paul died on the street of heart failure due to the heat. The heat rose to 100 degrees by July 2nd. Now, Mr. Colantonio continued in his article, "When 100-degree temperatures arrived on July 2nd, Revere Beach outside of Boston recorded over 150,000 visitors. Trolleys and ferries found record business as city dwellers rode night and day just to catch a breeze." The New York Evening World Night Edition headline for July 3rd jumped off the page. "The heat, hundreds prostrate, no relief in sight, 97 degrees. Now asphalt streets soften under the torrid sun rays." Pretty dramatic. But it just wasn't the East Coast. The article continued, "The entire country suffers in grip of fierce heat so far this summer." Now on the second page, a cartoon showed how people were dealing with the exceedingly high temperatures. However, the worst was yet to come. The official start of the hot wave, as it was called, was July 4th, 1911. On the 4th of July, record temperatures were set throughout New England. The Washington Herald's headline for that day said, "Torrid waves claim 149 victims in large cities." The paper posted a chart of the deaths and prostrations in the country's heat wave chart. Now, the New England states, the temperatures were deadly. In New Hampshire, the temperature reached 106 degrees. In Maine, it was 105 degrees. Vermont was also the same. Now in Boston, it only reached 104 degrees. However, the country still went on with the 4th of July festivities. The July 5th edition of the New York Tribune headline stated, "Terrific heat claims 35 more victims. 15 drowned in the waters about the city." In the New England cities and towns, it was reported that 31 people had died from the heat. Now, the parade held in Roxbury, Massachusetts, reported 40 sailors and coast artillerymen were overcome by the heat. Now, these were guys in the best of health. Now, of the officials riding at the head of the parade, more than half had to quit before the parade was over. In the waters off New England, it was reported that 6 people drowned trying to escape the deadly heat. Now, attendance for the doubleheader baseball games, America's pastime, were noticeably down. No one wanted to sit in the stands and roast under the baking sun except for the die-hard fans. Die being the operative word here. The elderly and the infants were affected the most by the heat, causing deaths in many instances. Factories had to shut down to the furnace-like conditions inside. The heat was beginning to affect people's mental faculties. With the heat, the lack of sleep, and the death rates being told in the morning papers, people were starting to lose it. Edward MacDonald was trying to keep cool by drinking. When his brother confronted him, Edward took out a gun and fired almost point blank at his brother. The shots went wild, luckily, probably because he was inebriated. Edward chased his brother, still brandishing the gun. However, it was the timely intervention of Edward's mother that saved Edward from a murder charge and his brother from a case of terminally dead. As it was, the magistrate held Edward without bail on attempted murder charges. Didn't even take the heat into consideration, I guess. The Washington Evening Star, July 11th edition, reported 4 deaths and 3 prostrations were recorded by noon. Crazed by the extreme heat, Jacob Seeger, an aged resident of Roxbury, killed himself with a revolver today. The New York Tribune, July 7th, reported Peter Hoffman of number 325 East 75th Street was arrested last night by patrolman Arthur Davis and locked up in the East 67th Street station, charged with felonious assault and intoxication. See, Hoffman, according to the story of Davis told, was suddenly partially crazed by the heat and ran from his home carrying a cleaver in his hand. Now, Davis tried to get the knife, but Hoffman resisted, and in the ensuing struggle, Davis's right hand was cut and 2 fingers partially separated. Hoffman, a powerfully built man, had nearly gotten Davis on his back when assistance came. Now, people say certain drugs will give you extraordinary strength. Oppressive heat will do the same thing. Now, the temperature would drop to 80 degrees at night, but it was impossible to get any sleep. Now, to escape the unbearable heat of the tenement apartments as well as the small city houses, people began sleeping in parks, on fire escapes, even in alleyways that could provide some kind of a breeze. Now, the city parks were a good place to sleep, but they could also be dangerous. The New England Historical Society website stated, parks and beaches were open for sleeping. Now, in the tenement slums, the sidewalks were lined with blankets and mattresses, as thieves commonly stole hats, coats, and wallets. Boston Common was described as the biggest boarding house in New England. 5,000 men, women, and children slept there on the ground at night during the 1911 Heatwave. Every day the papers kept promising relief, but it never came. Now the sale of ice and ice cream were going through the roof. The New York Tribune, July 10th, stated in Pittsburgh, ice was selling for $23 a ton. In just 10 days, the cost of a ton of ice went from $3 to $23. That's an 87% jump in price. Talk about price gouging. Now, the New York Sun wrote on July 11th about the confiscation of ice by the mayor of Toledo. It seems that Mr. Norvell, the president of the City Ice Delivery Company, had ordered 400,000 tons of ice. Now, it had been hijacked, legally confiscated by the mayor of Toledo for the use by the citizens of Toledo through the Toledo Ice and Fuel Company. You see, Norvell's train load of ice was transported through Toledo. President Norvell asked the mayor of Cleveland, a Mr. Bear, to get the ice back. So, Mayor Bear telegraphed Mayor Brand Whitlock of Toledo that a suit would soon be forthcoming if they did not send the 4,000 tons of ice to Cleveland immediately. Mayor Bear also stated, "Hey, I don't blame Whitlock if he ordered the confiscation. I'd have done the same thing under the circumstances." Mayor Bear threatens a lawsuit against Toledo's Mayor Whitlock, but says he would have done the same thing. I guess Mayor Bear was just placating President Norvell of the City Ice Delivery Company. I mean, why else would he have made that statement? I mean, the citizens of the great city of Cleveland would never elect an incompetent leader, now would they? The Newark Evening Star announced in their July 11th edition extended free ice distribution to Harris Needy. The Star sends tickets to Dr. Henry Aller and Dr. A.A. Mulligan, who will give them to mothers upon application. Now, not all people were able to get ice. The July 7th edition of the New York Tribune ran a story about ice riots at the Ice Pier. The poor people of the East Side tenements were the greatest sufferers. Yesterday there was a riotous demonstration at the Ice Pier. The story described the experience of one Mrs. Hoffman of number 119 Cannon Street. She said, "My man was sick and I had to get down to the dock myself with the baby in my arms. I waited from 6 o'clock until 11, and then when I went up for my piece of ice, the man in the office threw a pail of water in my face." The story also related how another woman was begging at the man's feet for ice, and still another had fainted in line. In New York City, the lack of ice was becoming a problem for the city government. By July 13th, the Evening Herald stated in bold headlines, "District Attorney joins Waldo," he was the police commissioner at the time, "in attempt to break up Ice Combine." The East Siders who were refused products swore out a complaint. This caused action in the DA's office, which caused action in the police department. Commissioner Waldo assigned the task of investigating the great ice conspiracy to Deputy Commissioner Doherty, who immediately sent out a big squad of his most intelligent detectives to gather evidence. Most intelligent detectives? It seems there were still a few dullards on the force even after Teddy Roosevelt's reforms of the late 1890s. Anyways, now July 14th, the heat wave had passed. The New York Tribune stated, "Heat wave, thing of the past." The recent heat wave seems to have passed, for the best it could do yesterday was to attain a high point of only 86 degrees. That was at 3 o'clock. Besides the welcome lack of furnace heat of the last 10 days, Manhattan Island was cooled throughout the day by a refreshing breeze. The paper also reported that New England had a death toll of 319 people from the heat. Now, with the passing of the Hotwave, which held New England in its grip for 10 out of the first 12 days in July, seasonal temperatures were restored today. Okay, the total number of deaths from this 10-day heat wave in New England are confirmed at 389. However, some estimates put the death toll anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. No one will ever really know how many people died from this hot wave, as they called it back then. Now, my grandparents lived through this hot wave. They were young, healthy, and they were able to cope with the heat. I just wonder, though, if they slept in the Boston Common or on one of the beaches around Boston. They never really talked about it. I wish I had asked. Now, it was just an annoying inconvenience that they had to put up with. Anyways, I hope you found this video interesting. Hey, if you did, please hit the like button, ring the bell, and leave a comment below. That tells the algorithm to push my videos out to more people. Hey, also, it would be great if you would subscribe to my channel. Again, thank you for watching.